Megan Blake wasn't sure what to expect when she transferred to St. Ignatius Catholic High School in the small town of Ashgrove. It was a far cry from the bustling city she was used to, with its towering buildings and endless crowds. Here, everything seemed quieter, too quiet. The old Gothic-style school, with its towering spires and dark hallways, felt like stepping into another world. On her first day, Megan was met with the usual stares that came with being the new girl. She wasn't exactly looking to stand out, but something about St. Ignatius made it impossible not to feel like an outsider. That was until she met three girls who seemed different from everyone else. Grace, Ivy, and Natalie weren't like the other students at the school. There was something about them, an air of mystery, a quiet confidence that immediately drew Megan in. They were beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. They moved through the halls as if they knew something no one else did. Megan quickly learned that no one dared to mess with them. Rumors swirled about the trio, that they were witches, that they dabbled in the occult, that strange things happened to anyone who crossed them. At first, Megan dismissed the rumors as nothing more than high school gossip. But after a few days, she found herself drawn to the trio. When they invited her to sit with them at lunch, she hesitated but accepted, intrigued by their allure. "We've been watching you," Grace said one day, her piercing green eyes studying Megan closely. "There's something about you." Megan laughed it off. "I'm just a regular girl." Natalie, the quietest of the group, shook her head. "No, you're not. There's more to you than that. We can feel it." Ivy leaned in closer, her voice a whisper. "We're witches, Megan. Real witches, and we think you could be one of us." Megan's heart raced. Witches? Surely they were joking, but the look in their eyes told her they weren't. That night, unable to shake the conversation, Megan found herself dreaming of strange symbols, ancient rituals, and the feeling of power coursing through her veins. When she woke, she felt different, like something inside her had shifted. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet the girls that weekend. They took her to an abandoned chapel deep in the woods, long forgotten by the town. Ivy explained that this was where they practiced their magic, calling upon the ancient forces they had learned to control. Megan wasn't sure what to expect, but there was an undeniable energy in the air that night, something electric and raw. "We're more powerful together," Grace said as they formed a circle under the pale moonlight. "Alone, we can do small things, little spells, small charms, but together, we're unstoppable." Megan's skin tingled as they began their ritual, calling to the four corners of the earth: air, fire, and water. She could feel the energy building around them, a swirling force that seemed to lift them off the ground. It was intoxicating. For the first time in her life, Megan felt like she belonged. Over the next few weeks, the girls grew closer, their bond strengthening with every spell they cast. At first, they used their powers for harmless things, changing the weather, manipulating small objects, causing brief flashes of light. But as their power grew, so did their ambitions. Grace was the leader, always pushing the group to go further, to test their limits. It started with small acts of revenge, targeting bullies, teachers who gave them bad grades soon, but spells became darker. Grace wanted control, and the others followed her lead. Megan began to feel uneasy. Something about the way Grace relished in their newfound power didn't sit right with her. But the more she tried to distance herself, the more entangled she became. Grace wouldn't let her leave the circle. "We're bound now," Grace said, her voice dripping with authority. "You can't walk away from this." One night, as the girls gathered for what was supposed to be their most powerful ritual yet, Megan's fears were realized. They planned to summon a spirit from the other side, something far more dangerous than any spell they had cast before. As the ritual progressed, the air grew heavy, the temperature dropped, and a dark presence began to fill the chapel. Natalie and Ivy looked nervous, but Grace was unfazed, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Megan tried to stop them, but it was too late. The spirit they had summoned was far beyond their control. Shadows twisted around them, and the walls of the chapel seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air grew thick with malevolent energy, and a low growl echoed through the space. Panic set in as they realized they had unleashed something far more dangerous than they could handle. The spirit lashed out, and the candles they had lit flickered violently before going out. In the darkness, Megan could hear the others screaming, but she couldn't see them. The force knocked her to the ground, and for a moment she felt as though she was sinking into the earth itself. When she opened her eyes, the chapel was silent, save for the distant sound of rustling leaves. Ivy and Natalie were huddled in a corner, shaking, but Grace was nowhere to be found. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, and Grace had vanished without a trace. The remaining girls fled the chapel, their once tight-knit group shattered by fear. They never spoke of that night again, and no one ever saw Grace again. The town believed she had simply run away, but Megan knew the truth. They had played with forces they didn't understand, and Grace had paid the ultimate price. Megan left St. Ignatius soon after, the weight of that night hanging over her like a curse. She would never forget the power they had wielded, nor the terrible cost of their ambition. In the year 1965, nestled in the heart of San Luis, a small town in northern Mexico, there was an orphanage that sat on the outskirts, overlooked by most of the locals. Within its walls lived a girl named Isabella, who often found herself lost in daydreams about magic, witches, and the unknown. Isabella was an outsider even among the orphans, her fascination with the occult setting her apart. While the others played games, she spent hours poring over tattered books on witchcraft she had scavenged from the old library nearby. One day at school, Isabella crossed paths with Maria, a lonely but wealthy girl whose life of privilege had left her isolated. Maria's parents were often away on business trips, and her sprawling mansion, though beautiful, was filled with a suffocating emptiness. The two girls couldn't have been more different, yet something about Isabella's dark allure drew Maria in. "You know," Isabella whispered one afternoon as they sat beneath an old tree by the school, "I'm a real witch." Maria's eyes widened in a mix of awe and disbelief. "You're not serious?" "Serious enough," Isabella replied with a smirk. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can do things. Make people see things, hear things that aren't there. I can even curse them if I want." Maria was skeptical at first, but the idea of magic, of something beyond her dull and lonely existence, was intoxicating. Despite her better judgment, she agreed to let Isabella prove her powers. The following week, the girls began playing a dangerous game of make-believe, or so it seemed. They ventured to an abandoned house on the edge of town, a place whispered to be cursed by the locals. Inside, with only the dim light of candles flickering against the crumbling walls, Isabella performed small rituals, nothing serious at first, just children playing with things they didn't understand. But soon, the games began to take a darker turn. One evening, after a particularly intense ritual, in which Isabella claimed she had summoned a spirit, strange things began happening around Maria. It started with little things. Scratches on the walls that hadn't been there before, the sound of footsteps in her home when she was alone. Then, the nightmares began. Visions of shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed, whispering her name. Maria confronted Isabella, shaken by the experience, but Isabella only smiled. "I told you I was a witch." The game, once fun and thrilling, had become something far more sinister. Maria wanted out, but Isabella was in too deep. Fueled by a newfound sense of power, Isabella started pushing the boundaries, convinced that her magic was real. She grew more reckless, more dangerous. One night, Isabella convinced Maria to join her for one final ritual. This one, she said, would summon a demon, proof that her powers were undeniable. Fear gnawed at Maria, but she couldn't tear herself away from the magnetic pull of Isabella's dark world. They returned to the abandoned house, now overgrown with vines and shadows. Isabella had stolen an old, dusty book from the library, filled with strange symbols and incantations. As they stood in the center of the house, the air thick with tension, Isabella began to chant words Maria didn't understand. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the wind picked up, howling through the broken windows. The temperature in the room dropped, and the candles flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. Maria's heart raced as a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. "Stop!" Maria screamed, her voice breaking through the rising chaos. "This isn't a game anymore." But Isabella's eyes were wild with something dark and unrecognizable. She had gone too far, and whatever force they had stirred was beyond their control. The growling grew louder, and from the shadows something began to take form. A figure, tall and twisted, with eyes like burning coals. Maria turned to run, but the door slammed shut on its own. Panic surged through her as she pounded on the door, desperate to escape. Behind her, Isabella's voice grew frantic as the figure advanced. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." But it was too late. The next morning, Maria's parents returned to an eerily quiet house. They found her curled up in her bed, silent, her once bright eyes dull and empty. She refused to speak, refused to move as if something had taken hold of her, and refused to let go. Isabella was never seen again. The townspeople whispered of curses, of witchcraft, and of the dangers of meddling with things beyond understanding. The abandoned house on the edge of town was left to crumble, though some claimed to see flickering lights from its windows on stormy nights and hear faint whispers carried on the wind. As for Maria, she remained a shell of the girl she once was, haunted by the memories of that night. No one knew what truly happened in that house, but the town of San Luis was never quite the same after. In the shadows of the town, the game continued. Steve Clark adjusted his backpack, taking a deep breath as he stepped through the gates of Crestwood High for the first time. The town of Newton Falls was picturesque, almost too perfect, with its neat rows of houses and freshly painted picket fences. But the charm didn't settle right with Steve. Something about it was off. Maybe it was the eerily quiet streets or the too polite neighbors. His gut told him that behind the smiles and well-manicured lawns, there was something sinister lurking in the town. As Steve made his way through the school's corridors, he noticed a group of students walking in perfect synchronization. They all wore the same bright blue jackets, with an embroidered emblem of a ribbon across the chest. "The Blue Ribbons," someone whispered as they passed. "They're the school's perfect students," said Jenny, a classmate sitting beside Steve in biology. She smirked, twirling her hair around her finger. "Straight A's, always polite, involved in every activity. It's like they've never had a bad day in their lives." "Sounds pretty intense," Steve muttered, still watching the group as they disappeared around a corner. Something about their movements seemed robotic, too calculated, too flawless. "And no one finds it weird?" "Everyone knows," Jenny replied with a shrug. "But no one talks about it." Later that afternoon, Steve met his new friend Derek behind the school gym. Derek was the opposite of a blue ribbon. Rebellious, disheveled, always causing trouble. The two had clicked immediately. But that day, Derek was quieter than usual, distracted. "I'm thinking of joining them," Derek said suddenly, nodding toward the group of blue ribbons assembling in the quad. His eyes were glazed over as if he wasn't fully present. "What? No way," Steve scoffed. "You, Mr. Rebel?" Derek chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "There's something about them, man. They're different, but in a good way." The next day, Derek showed up to school in a crisp blue jacket, his usual sarcasm replaced with eerie politeness. Steve watched in disbelief as his once unruly friend followed the blue ribbons, eyes forward, a perfect model student. "Derek!" Steve called out, but Derek didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge him. The group moved together like a well-oiled machine, leaving Steve standing there, stunned. Steve's curiosity turned to obsession. He needed to understand what had happened to Derek. He started digging into the town's history, spending hours in the library, searching through old newspapers and records. The deeper he went, the more disturbing patterns he uncovered, strange disappearances, sudden personality changes, all connected to the Blue Ribbons. There were even whispers of an underground program conducted by the town's psychiatrist, Dr. Randall Mason, who had been working with troubled teens for years. But why were all his patients ending up perfect, robotic versions of themselves? One night, Steve decided to follow Derek and the Blue Ribbons after school. Keeping his distance, he trailed them through the town, his heart pounding as they moved toward an old abandoned building on the outskirts. As they entered, Steve slipped in behind them, sticking to the shadows. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic. He peered through a crack in the door of a dimly lit room. Dr. Mason stood before a row of reclined chairs, each occupied by a student wearing a blue ribbon jacket. Their eyes were open but vacant, as if they were in a trance. Machines hummed softly around them, wires connected to their temples. "We're making progress," Dr. Mason said to a figure in the corner. "Soon, every student in Newton Falls will be part of this." Steve's heart raced. The town wasn't perfect by chance. This was a calculated, horrifying plan to mold every teenager into a compliant, mindless version of themselves. The blue ribbons weren't just a clique, they were part of a larger experiment, one designed to strip away individuality and turn people into obedient citizens. Before he could pull back, the door creaked, and Dr. Mason's eyes snapped toward Steve's hiding spot. "Who's there?" Dr. Mason's voice was cold, sharp. Steve's pulse quickened. He turned and bolted, sprinting through the dark corridors, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Behind him, he could hear the distant sound of footsteps closing in. They were coming for him. The next morning, Crestwood High seemed just as perfect as ever. Students moved in perfect unison, teachers smiled their hollow smiles, and Derek sat with the blue ribbons clasped, his eyes devoid of any recognition when Steve passed by. But Steve knew the truth now, and that truth gnawed at him with every step he took. The town of Newton Falls was far from the perfect facade it presented. Beneath the surface, something dark and insidious was at work, and Steve was next. He had to find a way out before they came for him too. Father Jerome stood in the dimly lit church, his heart heavy with the weight of the task ahead. He had been called to perform an exorcism, a ritual he had assisted in before, but never let alone. Kneeling before the statue of Christ, he prayed for strength, knowing this would test him like never before. The family waited anxiously nearby, Vincent and his wife holding their daughter, Margaret, tightly by the arms. The girl's eyes were wide and glassy, her body slick with sweat. She seemed fragile, but Father Jerome could sense something far darker lurking within her. As he approached them, he opened his old leather-bound prayer book. "Bring her to the center, under the dome," he instructed. Vincent and his wife complied, dragging Margaret forward. The girl's face twisted, her features distorted by some unseen force. Suddenly she spoke, not in her own voice, but in a guttural, rasping tone that didn't belong to a child. "All will go to pot," she growled, a cruel smile stretching across her face. Jerome steeled himself, trying to ignore the wave of fear tightening his stomach. He began the prayers, sprinkling holy water as he recited the ancient words, "Crux sancta sit mihi lux, non draco sit mihi dux." The girl's body arched violently, her clothes tearing as if an invisible hand had sliced through them. She mocked him, hurling vile insults in a voice that grew deeper, more inhuman with each passing second. Her body contorted, grotesque and unnatural. "Are you scared, priest?" she spat. "You haven't seen anything yet." But Jerome pressed on, his voice unwavering as he continued the rite. The more he prayed, the more violent Margaret's movements became, her eyes rolling back, her mouth frothing, and her words devolving into a guttural mix of laughter and snarls. Finally, with a primal scream, her body collapsed, and she lay still. The family rushed to her, sobbing. Jerome watched as a thin black plume of smoke seeped from her nostrils, spiraling upward. It hovered briefly before darting toward the church's chancel, disappearing into the shadows. Exhausted but relieved, he assured the parents that their daughter was safe now, advising them to take her to the hospital. But the priest's heart was troubled. Something felt unfinished. After the family left, Father Jerome returned to the front of the church, his legs shaking with exhaustion. He looked at the statue of Christ, hoping for solace, for a sign that his efforts had not been in vain. He knelt before it, whispering a prayer of gratitude. But as he muttered the words, a strange heat pulsed above him. The statue's face glistened as if crying. He blinked, his mind reeling from fatigue and the brandy he had taken earlier to calm his nerves. But the tears on the statue didn't stop. He tried to refocus, praying louder. "Thank you, Lord, for helping me exorcise this demon," he said. But something was wrong. The statue's face was changing, the paint melting, its eyes darkening into two voids. Then, with a slow, deliberate creak, the head of the statue turned toward him. "You exorcised nothing," a deep, mocking voice boomed. Father Jerome's breath caught in his throat. The statue of Christ began to move, unhooking itself from the cross and bending in unnatural spider-like contortions. It crawled along the walls like its laughter echoing through the church, a grotesque mockery of holiness. Jerome grabbed a vial of holy water, splashing it frantically toward the possessed figure. "In the name of Christ, be gone," he cried. The demon recoiled, but then laughed again, its voice dripping with disdain. "You think this water hurts me? You fool." Without warning, the demon began to spit, literal fire erupting from its mouth, setting the pews and tapestries ablaze. The church rapidly filled with smoke, and the heat grew unbearable. The flames licked the walls, consuming everything in their path. Father Jerome backed away, terrified, as the fire spread through the nave, scorching the sacred icons and stained glass. The church had become a furnace, its beauty blackened by the demon's wrath. Jerome stumbled, the overwhelming heat forcing him to retreat toward the entrance. His mind raced, unable to process the chaos before him. Was this hell? Was this his punishment? Suddenly, a loud banging came from the front doors. He could hear sirens wailing outside. Firefighters and police burst in, pulling him from the inferno. Jerome, dazed and broken, tried to explain what had happened, but no one listened. His breath smelled of alcohol, and the officers assumed he had set the fire in a drunken stupor. They handcuffed him and led him outside, ignoring his pleas. As the police cruiser drove him away, Jerome looked back at the burning church. Through the smoke, he saw something that chilled him to the bone, the black mist from Margaret's exorcism. It slithered out from the church, unseen by the firefighters, and seeped into the grill of the fire truck parked outside. Jerome's heart sank. The demon had escaped. In the distance, the fire truck veered suddenly, its driver jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Father Jerome, helpless in the backseat of the police car, realized the terrible truth. The evil he thought he had vanquished was still out there, and it was far from finished. It was unnervingly quiet as the family's car rumbled along the desolate road, its headlights cutting through the thick veil of darkness. The air outside was cold, pressing against the windows like a silent force, and inside the car there was an uneasy stillness. The moon hung low, casting long, eerie shadows across the surrounding fields. Sam, sitting in the back seat, drummed his fingers on the armrest, trying to break the tension. His parents, seated in the front, exchanged quiet words, the kind of concerned murmurs parents used when they didn't want their kids to know they were lost. The GPS had stopped working miles back, and the further they drove, the less familiar everything seemed. Maybe we should just stop and ask for directions, Sam's father muttered, glancing at the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed. We've been on this road for an hour, and I don't see any sign of a town or a gas station. Yeah, Sam chimed in, trying to sound upbeat. Maybe we'll meet some ghost or creepy hitchhiker who can help us out. He smirked at his own joke, but no one laughed. His mother gave him a sharp look. As if on cue, the headlights picked up the faint outline of a figure up ahead, standing by the side of the road. Sam squinted, leaning forward between the seats. Well, speak of the devil. The man was motionless, illuminated by the car's beams as they slowed to a stop. He looked oddly out of place, his clothes rumpled and too heavy for the mild night, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He stood at the edge of a small dirt path, staring at them with unsettling stillness. Sam's father rolled down the window halfway and leaned out slightly. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "We're looking for the nearest town. Our GPS cut out, and we've been driving for a while. Do you know if there's a gas station or somewhere we can stop for the night?" The man didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, as though contemplating the question, then took a slow step toward the car. "Ain't no town nearby," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "But there's a cemetery not far from here, just up the road." His lips curled into what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. "A cemetery?" Sam's father frowned, unsure what to make of the reply. Thanks, but we're looking for somewhere a little more alive." Sam, ever the prankster, saw an opportunity. He leaned forward, his face breaking into a mischievous grin. "A cemetery, huh? Perfect. Maybe you can show me the way. We've got a dead body in the trunk I need to bury." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Sam winked at the man. His father groaned audibly. "Sam, not now. Seriously." But the man didn't react the way they expected. He didn't laugh it off or roll his eyes. Instead, he simply stared at Sam, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the family exchanged uneasy glances. There was something off about him, something they couldn't quite place. Then, without a word, the man stepped back into the shadows. His figure faded into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. "Well, that was weird," Sam muttered, but the uneasy feeling in his stomach betrayed his bravado. His joke, which should have lightened the mood, had only added to the creeping sense of dread that seemed to cling to the night. His father rolled up the window and hit the gas, eager to leave the strange encounter behind. The car sped up, and the man was soon swallowed by the distance, disappearing into the rearview mirror. "Great joke, Sam," his mother said sharply. "That's just what we needed." "Relax," Sam replied, though his voice was less confident than before. "It was just a joke." The guy was creepy anyway. The road stretched ahead endlessly, the trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. The night had a way of making everything feel wrong, Sam thought. Maybe it was just the emptiness of the road, or the fact that they were lost. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. Just as Sam was about to drift into his usual routine of bantering with his siblings, his father slammed on the brakes, sending everyone lurching forward in their seats. "What the hell?" he muttered, staring wide-eyed at the road ahead. There, in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights, was Sam. Sam's mind froze. He was sitting in the back seat. But there, standing in the road, was a perfect image of himself. Only he wasn't standing. His doppelganger was hunched over, clutching something in his hands. As the light caught it, Sam saw what it was. A doll. The same doll that had been sitting in the back seat with his younger sister earlier. Only now, the doll's tiny hands were wrapped around the figure's throat, as if strangling him. "What the?" Sam's voice cracked as he stared at the figure. It looked just like him. His clothes, his hair, even the way his shoulders slouched slightly. But it couldn't be him. It wasn't him. He was right here, in the car. The figure in the road turned its head slowly, its eyes locking onto the family. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he realized the doll was moving. Its tiny fingers tightened around the figure's neck, and the figure, his doppelganger, collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud. The family was frozen in terror, staring at the motionless body lying in the middle of the road. Then, just as suddenly, the figure stirred. It stood up slowly, brushing dirt from its clothes, and began to laugh. The sound was unmistakable. It was Sam's laugh. Sam in the car felt his blood run cold. Before anyone could react, the figure stood up straight, grinning. It waved at them with the doll still clutched in its hand. Then, in a voice identical to Sam's, it said, "Gotcha! Just kidding!" Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.